too in Southern Ireland, and they were interested in the last things. And I knew when I went on it was going to be a bit informal and a bit funny, and it was.
It was?
Yeah, it was like a 15-minute interview. I'll send you the link. At the end, because I'm dealing with state apparatus, I'm talking about the book that I made. I don't think I've got a copy. You know it probably. The last things, my bunker work. He started playing the James Bond theme tune halfway through the interview, which I wasn't expecting. That's quite funny, you know.
Well, that's the thing that
there's a whole Irish-English thing as well going on there.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah.
No, because actually the reason, and I don't know if I'll include this or not, but like the reason I'm doing this is partly because I find when I was listening to a lot of podcasts of.
Are we on now?
It is. I just
good.
To roll.
Yeah.
The reason I was doing this is partly because when I listen to a lot of photography podcasts and stuff, they're very taken very seriously, I think, which is good, but at the same time, sometimes I don't know how to explain it.
Well, I think what's missing from a lot of podcasts like that is the opposite. Actually, there's a sort of criticality which is missing from those sorts of conversations.
What kind of criticality?
Well, just talking about, I mean, I don't want to sort of dismiss anybody's efforts because they're always really entertaining and so on. But often there's not a sort of, you don't get a sort of good debate necessarily about work and about the sort of stuff that we might talk about, particularly when we're producing documentary photography. So there's that. But I agree with you about, let's just relax into a conversation and talk.
Yes.
Well.
I agree. I think, but this is the thing. I find that it either goes one way or it goes the other. So it either becomes like this very heavy, serious thing about, and then especially when academia gets involved, feels particularly even heavier.
People are fearful of excluding audience, and that's a sort of reasonable fear, given that you can speak about academic issues and start to use language which is excluding the audience, but there's no real need to do that. I don't think it's like teaching. I mean, I've been guilty of it in the past a little bit by using kind of words and phrases that actually need explaining, and sometimes that's part of I see it as part of the education, that you're using terminology that's in common usage. We're at postgrad level here. So to explain them and to put those into context is a good thing, but it doesn't always translate in an educational environment. It's a good thing, but it doesn't always translate to this sort of platform.
But in academia, wouldn't that be the point also? So what I mean, like, so you feel like not even in academia, like even in academia is excluding, because not when you're teaching, you say. Even in academia, you feel like it can exclude people.
Well, no, I try not to. I mean, I don't know if you remember this, Gianluca, but one of my early sessions with you guys was, this is phraseology that's in common usage within this discourse that you are that you're working in. And it's really good for you to have a grip on it, really, because sometimes a single word can explain a multitude of different things or a multitude of different sort of possibilities. So, in terms of education, that's the role of the educator is to be as clear as possible about those. Perhaps befuddling terms or, sort of overcomplicated phraseology and so on. And therefore to make it simpler. But I just think what I'm saying is that I think that when those ideas sometimes transfer into this sort of space, it's problematic sometimes. I think people who run podcasts are sometimes fearful of, losing audience or becoming a little bit too ivory tower, if people still use that term, out of touch and so on. But I disagree. I mean, I think you can, deal with quite complex things in quite simple ways.
Yeah, I mean, because I feel like it makes talking quicker.
Yeah.
No, like at the end of the day, that's what it shortens.
Yeah.
That's the idea. And we all know what we're talking about when we say.
Yeah. Whatever we want to say.
Whatever big word. But when I feel like sometimes that becomes a sign of status or like sign of maybe within academia or within people that have studied a lot, or it just feels like they could have said that not simpler even, but like they could have said with different words without taking any of it. But I feel like they either are too used to talking that way.
Yeah.
But for me, if it's overcomplicated, then there's no.
Well,
why using it?
I think we're saying the same things in different ways here.
Yeah.
you know, because I'm talking about simplicity of language.
Yeah.
And I, as an educator, sometimes achieve that, and other times I don't achieve it. You know, but I think it's to be, you know, it's to aspire to. I think in an educational environment, so as many people can join in as possible.
Yeah, and how do you find? Because something I was thinking to ask you is, how do you find? Do you ever compare when you were a student to when you are a tutor now, and like, because now you work in university? How do you compare those? Does it change the way you teach, the way you got taught? Were you like, oh, I would like to change this thing in the future?
Oh, it's certainly the way I was taught in the 80s was certainly sort of influenced the way I teach, with documentary practice particularly, and you know, the value of doing something, finding out through photography is really important, and that's how I was taught, and so that persists, whether the photography is something which is done on the laptop, you know, via a web link, or something which is where somebody's sort of on the street or interacting with another human being with, you know, with the camera. So the value of experience is something which is carried through. Most practitioners would say that. I've always thought about practice before theory anyway, you know, as a artist myself. The value of that is kind of foremost, I think, I try to make it foremost in my teaching, and also in my own work as well, because I think that if you're able to free yourself in practice, there's a potential of you kind of being less restrained, really. I find it difficult, you know, there are different models of engagement with photographic education.
What do you mean?
Well, I think there's kind of theoretical models, and I'm not anti-theory at all. But what I try and dissuade students from doing is sort of illustrating theory in some ways. So yes, you read a text, and it's interesting. You work it through your own system of making work, and then beyond that, you start to make something for yourself. It's when you can. I think it works. The relationship between relationship between theory and practice works when students are able to just assimilate this stuff, rather than sort of find it as something which is an instruction.
So you mean like doing it? So putting theory before?
Well, I'm thinking
practice.
Of the idea. You know, obviously there are texts on the course here that we read, and they're interesting texts, and you know, selected ones for this particular course, MA documentary course, as was by the time people listen to this, that are crucial to sort of histories of representation, for example, right? So, I mean, my idea is that if people can read those texts and understand them as just something which is there, as like a cloud to draw on or to assimilate or to be in from time to time, rather than using as something which is an instruction. Right.
What do you mean by histories of representation? Sorry, I have to...
Gianluca, you should know that.
I know, but I feel like, yeah, like.
How long have you been out of this place? 2 years.
But I mean, like, specifically, because I feel like it can mean a lot of things. But like, I understand what you're saying as a practice, as a more leading theory rather than the other way around.
Yeah,
or
I think
like
it's
both.
always. Yeah, I mean, I try and avoid a situation where theoretical ideas become too instructional. That's the best way I can put it.
Okay.
You know, that's the best way I can put it.
Okay.
But I also value it. Of course I value. You have to read. You have to read. You have to read and find out for yourself.
Do we have to read?
Yes. You have to read and find out for yourself. That's the thing. You find out for yourself from doing your own research, and your own research is taking photographs and reading.
Were you informed by reading when you did your first project, which is the one you shot in the what was the name?
Pictures from the Real World. Do you mean that project?
Pictures from the Real World. Yeah.
So, what was your question?
Whether reading informed?
No, it didn't. As an undergrad project, it didn't. I was purely influenced by the visual work that was around me as an undergraduate student doing a BA in the 1980s, when there were only probably 5 photography courses in the whole country. Probably none in Spain. I don't know about that.
Yeah.
Maybe one in Italy, So I was totally, I was reading Sakura and all that, but it didn't go in. I wasn't interested in it at that time. I just wanted to make photographs that were complex and empathetic images that were a reflection of how I saw things. And that's how I wanted to do that work, So at that time, no, it was a different time. And anyway, we're making a distinction here between undergrad study and postgrad study as well, I think. I'm making a distinction.
Anyway. Yeah, I mean, even studying or not studying, like I think recently I was thinking like, well, I think it's a go-to question to ask sometimes. I find myself asking, what do you study or whatever, but I find that it doesn't really matter that much, at least in the particular, in photography and this kind of things that I find sometimes more practical. I find like studying, of course, helps, and I think it's a time to do stuff.
Yeah.
But it doesn't really necessarily matter as in terms of whether it makes you a better or less. I think photographer, because as you said again, this thing of the practice, and actually I wanted to ask you, because something that I find always very interesting, which is because you were part of what someone coined the second wave of color photography in documentary. Yeah. And that means, of course, there's a first one, but I was wondering how much. I always find fascinating photographing. How do you see color documentary photography? How do you go around? Because when you go and document a place, you're kind of seeing through that view when you haven't seen that much of it before. Like the language. I don't know if I'm explaining myself.
Keep going.
There's a language that is built that nowadays everyone will be like, to say the most famous is Martin Parr, and be like, that kind of color, flash, blah blah blah, as a reference in terms of a language. And I feel like Martin Parr and people from that generation, and then the second wave, and you guys building a language that nowadays like referential. No, it's like, that looks like that thing. Yeah. But how do you do it when there's no reference? Do you see what I mean?
How do you do what? How do
you go and do color documentary photography?
But there was a reference. I mean, my reference actually before I went to Farnham to study, and was taught by Martin and Paul Graham and other people too. I mean, it was a very sort of exciting time for British practice, because everything was happening within a sort of postmodern discourse, a post-structural discourse. So we not only had the colorists like Martin and Paul Graham, but we had Joe Spence coming in, and we had Chris Killip coming in, right? And we had a vast breadth, of engagement with people who were making work at that time, and everyone was looking at this stuff and being excited by it because it was so fresh and so new, and also there was so little of it comparatively as well. I mean, but in terms of your question, the references was American work, was American documentary practice. So I was certainly aware of people like Meyerowitz and Sternfeld and Eggleston and people like that. All the big names before I started to study. So I'd been working on transparency E6 before I went to study at Farnham. I've been sort of imitating lots of American colorist work in my home city of Derby, shooting on a 35mm slide film, basically. So that was the reference. There was no reference. The reference was there already. All you had to do was go to the library, and then, when I found Paul Graham's A.1, the Great Northern Road book, in the library at Derby College of Higher Education, when I was doing an A-level in photography. That was a revelation to find. There's a British version of this. Look at this, and it's on large format camera and all the rest of it. It was a sort of absolute epiphany, really, to find Paul's book in that library at that time. So it was sort of building. Anyway, that sort of relationship between British work and American work was already there.
The surprise. Where did the surprise come from? Like, oh wow, there's someone doing in the UK. Because I find it interesting. I think again, like when things change and innovation. Usually such a simple thing like photographing in color, which nowadays is like, oh yeah, why? How come no one thought of that? Of course, it's a silly question, but like, no, at the same time I find it interesting because it's like, oh, someone had to be the first one to be like, oh, I can do that in the UK, no?
Yeah.
And that was, how come that was?
I mean, the times were so different, Gianluca. I mean, they were so different, in terms of people's expectations of documentary practice were really quite limited to 35mm black and white and a bit of medium format and so on. But I mean, that's the sort of translation here that's perhaps not being understood by yourself in some ways. So, it was a really different thing. It was a really, lots of different. I can't really express to you really how different it was that someone made a colour documentary series of photographs in England. It's revelatory.
Yeah, but that's the thing for me that I find interesting, that is like, especially really good innovations, it takes just such a simple.
Yeah.
It usually looks obvious later.
Yeah. It does look obvious later.
Some of the best ideas then is like, oh.
I didn't get this. I gave a talk once 10 years ago, maybe 15 years ago, in a format festival, I think it was, and I was talking about Pictures from the Real World, because the full title of Pictures from the Real World is Pictures from the Real World, Colour Photographs 1987 to 1988. So this guy was saying to me, why have you put that it's colour photographs? This was in 2013 or something like that. And I failed to understand the significance of his perspective, and it's what you're bringing here as well.
What do you mean?
Well, I failed to understand the fact that he couldn't imagine a world when there weren't colour documentary photographs, and then suddenly there are.
Yeah.
It's well rehearsed. I mean, this sort of conversation in many ways.
Yeah.
I failed to understand his questioning, because I didn't really answer the question. I said, well, just because they are colour photographs, and I should have said, well, it's because there were no other colour photographs at that time of this sort of thing, other than other than the obvious ones that just started to make them. I mean, there's only maybe, I don't know who coined the second generation of colour British, whatever it is. I don't know who coined that, but there's only probably 3 years difference between the first wave and the second wave. Anyway, I would say, if you're looking at it like that,
Yeah, but there must be a difference, and then one of the main differences will be having some sort of reference.
Yeah.
Because I guess the first.
I think it's because we were all taught by the first wave. I think that's what it was, really, and we're all influenced by them.
Yeah, actually, and because I may be jumping around, but like, with the same, for me, the same question would go for the theatre play you made.
Yeah. And
again, I mean, I don't know if it's that in that case, did you have any reference?
No, I mean, actually, that was. I think what I did there is unprecedented. The series that we're talking about was made in 1988, was sort of finished in 1988. Pictures from the Real World was finished in 1988.
Yeah, it's a documentary about...
Yeah, so it's the families on a housing estate in Derby, different families, okay? And it showed in a few places, didn't get much publication. It was in Creative Camera in 1988, which was a really, important sort of landmark for me to have that work in there. And then I sort of left it. I didn't push it, and I sort of regret that in some ways, that I didn't push it at that time, because 3 years later, Nick Waplington made Living Room, which is a very similar body of work, and. Anyway, he did very well with that, and I thought, what about my work? But I sort of got on with other things and made other projects and so on. So 25 years, more or less, after that, I showed 5 photographs from Pictures from the Real World at Format International Festival in Derby, and from that, one person, Lisa, came out of the woodwork, and I eventually got her phone number. So she was one of the mothers of the family. So I thought it'd be really nice to meet her. I've not seen her for that amount of time. I met her, and I thought, maybe I'd want to do a bit more work here. I was quite clear that I didn't want to make more photographs. I was quite clear that in my mind that it would be much more of obvious participation with the people, with Lisa and John, as it turned out. And so we began this process of conversation, really, which ended up with me giving them the body of work that I'd made.
So handing them
handing them the contact sheets, all of the contact sheets. So Lisa and John were then married, they're now divorced, been divorced for 20 years. So I gave them both a set of contact sheets and asked them to select their own photographs from my work.
Okay, so this is a distance of how many years since you made the work?
25 years.
So 25 years, and then you met again with the people and gave them...
Yeah, more or less 25 years. Yeah, that'd be about right, yeah.
So you gave them the pictures to choose?
I gave them double-sized copies of the contact sheets, of the original contact sheets, and I gave them and asked them. I gave them a set of, a sort of criteria, because I thought there's a project in it. I didn't know what it was. I was being very intuitive and feeling my way through the project. I didn't know it was going to be a play. I didn't know anything about that. So this is part of a process. Let Lisa and John find some voice here, right, and choose their own photographs. So you can see I'm seeing it as an act of a sort of democratic act, which is opening up the document and, submitting my work to scrutiny of the subjects, the people within the photograph, right, because they're picking their own versions of the same circumstances.
And why do you feel this?
Why did I want to do it? Do you mean?
Yeah, like why do you feel like, especially such a long time after, why do you feel like
because one I think one changes and one understands I think what this admits is that documentary photography is always going to be a over selective and flawed genre within which to work, particularly when the representation of working class people is concerned. Okay.
Over selective, what do you mean?
Well, photography is so selective. You take a picture from a vast array of possibilities.
Okay.
And that photograph is often sort of governed by, quite simply, sometimes what a good photograph might be. That in the intervening years, I've read more. I've done more work. I've made work about power rather than the dispossessed, and so on and so forth. So it felt like a natural thing to do, to give them the work. Okay. And the thing I've got to say about the process is that it, as I've indicated, that it was an open-ended process. I didn't know where I was going with it, right, at all. So anyway, Lisa and John have these, and I met them both. It took 6 months, to do this. Met them both, and sat with both of them and recorded their conversations when we were going through the contact sheets. Okay. And they were talking about photographs. And I have these 2 audios. Didn't know what to do with it. So I thought, well, okay, maybe we can do something here where Lisa and John are involved in some re-presentation of the body of work in some public way, right? So we'll leave that there for a minute, okay? And they both said no. Quite clearly.
So they were like,
quite clearly. Which is not surprising. I have no experience of, public speaking, so I wasn't surprised. But I mean, just to sort of contextualise this and backtrack a bit, I mean, from being on this course that we look at documentary practice quite critically, right? We take it we put it in a dock, right? And pull it apart and find its weaknesses and so on, and find ethical strong points and challenges within the discourse that we're working within. So in some ways, giving these guys the archive is a continuation of that, right? Giving them the body of work is a continuation of that process where we're looking again, right, and we're reviewing things, and more so we're doing it with them. We're doing it with the subject. We're doing it with the people in the photograph. So that was the attraction for me. I was really excited by that, actually, because I thought, well, no one's really done this. No one's really, to my knowledge, right, gone and reviewed it and actually then done something with it. Particularly after the 25-year gap where everyone's grown older, right? I mean, I'm always interested in the performance of the subject in the photograph anyway, right? And I also had been doing research by doing acting and directing classes myself, in evening classes at the City Lit College in central London. So I'm interested in the idea of performance. I've been experimenting. I ended up doing an acting in a theatre.
Really?
Yeah, in a 15-minute play, in a proper theatre, and I took the lead role. You realise that when you walk on stage, your audience, like your students at university, are reading you from top to bottom. Right? They're looking at you and they're sussing you out straight away. So you have all that. There's all these interesting comparisons between the delivery of, the curriculum and the delivery of lines in a play. So that's going on. So I thought, well, maybe if Lisa and John don't want to do it, right? Maybe we can fictionalize it, okay, and bring this to stage in a way that's fresh and gets people to look again and think again about what documentary photography is and what it can do and so on. So that's basically how the play began, how the process began. So we worked from that, and basically because I had the audios from both of them, we had a great verbatim script, right? We had a verbatim script in the making, which I crafted.
What script, sorry?
Verbatim, which is word for word. It's like, we're having a conversation here. The translation of this will be verbatim if you ever write it down, translate it and something. Yeah. So, and verbatim theatre is a genre, social history theatre, social theatre, whatever. So I, used these texts, built a dialogue using these words, and we went from there really. And I think I've just done a PhD on it actually. I'm waiting for the viva as we sit here speaking. I don't know when it's going to be. It should be within a month, but I've done a PhD by publication on this, and I'm realising that I wrote about it because I all of this process that I'm describing to you now, I didn't really figure out exactly why I was doing it at the time. I was just being intuitive with 30 years worth of practice as a artist or photographer, fueling it, if you know what I mean, driving it. But there were many things within that and I needed to disentangle, hence writing about it, the last couple of years. So
and what did you find out? Why were you doing it then?
Well, I think the interesting thing, partly for the reason I've said, in that there's been a sort of accumulation of knowledge around participatory practice, which is of value. I've also recognised that, this was all there anyway, but I've sort of acknowledged how photography can, use stereotypes and archetypes to represent people, how photography is understood just as a two-dimensional form which has no voice. So I'm sort of challenging these things and more in the play, where Lisa and John, basically in the play, talk about my photographs and they criticise me. David never brought any prints around. He said he would, but he never did. That sort of stuff, right? So we have a screen. The play. You've probably seen the pictures,
Yeah.
And they're sitting there talking and they're arguing with each other about who that is in the photograph. So it opens everything up. Yeah. And what one thing that they did, they reclaimed. They had no interest in my artiness at all. None whatsoever.
What do you mean?
Well, that becoming. This is the great thing. The sort of the way that single photographs, can be different things to different people. This same image that I chose, right? And there was only one or two that I chose that they chose as well. Of course, I chose it for entirely different reasons. They're seeing their aunt or their daughter or whatever. And so they reclaimed the body of work for themselves as a family album in some ways.
Because they were talking about what's going on in the picture.
Yeah.
Is that
a contentious family album, perhaps.
Okay, so they were just more like what? Like, for example, like whether.
Well, there's a good example. There's a photograph in Pictures from the Real World of John weightlifting in a bedroom, and there's a little girl in front of it, and his daughter Nikki, who was there. As well, and he chose an entirely different photograph of himself looking really sort of competent and more masculine. I mean, mine was a contextual shot of the whole room. He's chose this picture of himself, which is a memory of him of a pastime that he used to enjoy, you know, a whole variety of different stuff. So that's what I mean. So that reclamation, that's the picture for him, was the interesting thing, you know, from the body of work from which I crafted a book, and they've got 30 pictures each, which are family album photographs.
Actually, I think I recently saw that. I think maybe it become a reference because I saw that there was a photographer that recently did also like an I was automatically I was David.
I become aware of in the last week that Larry Sultan's Pictures from Home hello is a Broadway play, and it's the parents, the people in the photograph talking about the photograph, and that's last year. I mean, last week.
He's talking about the photographs.
Yeah, it's exactly the, as far as I can see, it's exactly the same.
Oh wow! Because I didn't really look into it too much, but I remember I was like, oh, this is interesting. It's a play. It's about.
No, really, it's from what I can understand, it's exactly the same. They've
American.
But
so
American.
Like, so like with the British color.
I mean, you know, how do you do that? I mean, Larry Sultan is deceased now. He died some years ago, and this is a posthumous work by a theatre director, I think. So, yeah, I mean, it's what happens, right? I mean, I spoke to Campany about it recently, and he said, well, you should feel complimented. And I said, well, I do, but also feel irritated.
I mean, yeah, that's what they always say. It's like, oh, if they copy you, it's because you had a good idea. But
I mean, you know, it is a compliment. You know, it is a good idea. I mean, you know, I'm interested in doing more performance in the future anyway, in regard to that, you know.
Yeah, I mean, and again, for me, it goes back again to this. For me, it's interesting that now we're talking about the American side, kind of seeing the British. I guess because this would be documentary photography.
Yeah, Larry Sultan's was that body of work. It was pictures of his parents actually, who had moved to some retirement home or a condo, or I think it's described. I don't know. And he's there. He's going to visit them and just make photographs of them in this new space. And it's a great body of photographs, wonderful body of photographs. You know, but yeah, so that's what happens, right? It's,
yeah. No, I mean,
languages are borrowed, ideas are borrowed. You know, we sort of things are revised, altered slightly, and so on and so forth. You know, I mean, I look forward to see the play. I mean, I don't think I've got. It's such a different thing doing a play. I mean, the wonderful thing about it is the collaborative nature anyway. You know, I audition actors, I've got a co-producer, I've got you know, other people doing stuff for me, and that is a wonderful thing to do, to work on that. I mean, I found it a fantastically satisfying project to do, working in this way.
Do you find photography to be, do you think it's quite a lonely kind of?
Yeah, it can be, yeah, it can be. Yeah, I mean, it's what do they say? Ploughing the lonely furrow.
What does that mean?
Ploughing the lonely furrow. So you're there. You're ploughing the field on your own. You know, it's a good metaphor. Yes, it can be very, very difficult. You know, working on your own. You can only really do it yourself, right? I mean, in that sense, you know.
Well, even if it's, because in my head at the same time, it doesn't necessarily look like it, since you are, you know, we're involved with people and we work. And even when you were not with it, like in a family, even if it's other people's family, but like,
yeah,
there's always. Do you think there's always this? I think it's more like an inner feeling of the. No.
What do you mean?
Well, yeah, I mean, I think it's more of an inner feeling that, like, this doesn't mean you work alone, physically. You are with people.
Yeah.
But it's interesting because you talk about collaboration, and there seems to be this. I don't know if I would say longing, because I don't know if it's the right English word, but like making people be part of.
Okay, so
your work.
Maybe you're talking about a sort of desire, right, for what we might describe as a sort of social reconciliation with the people you're photographing.
But why reconciliation? Because for me, reconciliation
Is that what you mean?
there is conflict.
You might mean something else there. I don't know, but I'm just going to read it.
No, connection. I feel like it's bringing people in to do this thing that we started. But that's what I find funny is like I start a project and then suddenly like you find yourself involved in it.
No, I was thinking about
see
that.
What I mean?
I was thinking about that recently because where I live in South London, when I turned up in this area, I live on a particular street, Waterloo, and I was aware of a sort of community space, and I got involved with that, and I designed a street festival, and then a film festival within a couple of years, right? And it was all good community stuff. It was all local, you know, and I thought, well, you know, that's the purpose of this sort of stuff, really. But I know there are obviously some artists who would sort of make something which is much more geared towards fine art outcomes. And I don't know what I'm trying to say, really, Gianluca. Really, I just think that I did it for the right reasons. And often I see work which is then redistributed within a fine art discourse. Right? You see something like that, and it's re-platformed as actually forget this conversation.
That's fine.
Forget that one.
Okay.
It's going to get difficult. Yeah.
Sure. No,
yeah,
but I see what I mean. I think it's more for the purpose of connecting rather than for getting something out of it.
I mean, with Lisa and John, I mean, you know, if we talk about that as an example, I was really trying not to sort of pull them through it, and I don't think I was. I think they were both keen to be involved, and actually paid them a little bit of money as well for their participation. At every stage, it's obviously important that I'm checking in with them and saying this is what we're doing now. When there were various things that we did. When I'd written the script and we got the actors on board, Sarah and Alan, I took both the actors to Derby to meet the real Lisa and John. So they met their counterpoints that they'd be performing on the stage. And we did, in the case of Lisa, we did small performances in her living room of the play. Right, so she could get a sense of what it was. You know, we didn't do that at John's for different reasons, but there was a check-in with him at every stage and so on. So what you have to do is it's like when you make a documentary project with people, you have to kind of lay out as much as you can at the beginning, really, of what it is and your expectations of them and what obligations they might be under. Are they up for this? And there's the whole issue of informed consent and so on and so forth. And in fact, one of the things about I realised this afterwards, but if we're talking about working with people and perhaps submitting them to scrutiny again, I think one of the reasons at the beginning, I realise now, that one of the reasons that at the beginning why I didn't want to re-photograph Lisa and John, well, there's several, but I mean one of them being it would have been a very easy kind of before and now comparison, which would be quite reductive, I think, if I were to present that work in that way. So it was really important that we moved away from photography, actually. And at the time, I didn't know that's what it was happening. But intuitively, perhaps, you know, there was some direction of travel. But the fact that actually, in the final analysis, in the actual play itself, the fact that they are represented by other people, so kind of protects them a little bit from that. It works away. It works against that.
Yeah. So they keep a certain privacy.
Yeah.
Let's say.
Yeah, and they're speaking. They're talking. You know, but one thing that maybe contradicts that a little bit, but maybe not. I mean, we published the script as well with Makina Books. They published the script for me, and I put Lisa and John's photographs in that book. But the difference, of course, this time was that these photographs are contextualised with their voices rather than my own. So there's a reclamation of their own representation as they work through the play. It's a really nice little book. I don't have a copy. I'll give you a copy, which kind of works through the narrative of the. Well, it's just the script basically, because it was a slideshow, the Lisa and John slideshow.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I mean, and so what did they think about it? What did they?
Well,
when you told them all this.
Well, I mean, they were up for the idea, sure. Now, neither of them came to see the play. They were both unwell. Lisa was unwell. John was sick, but their family did come.
Okay.
Two of the daughters came to the play on the night, and one of the sort of and thank God they liked it. I mean, God, if it would have been awful if they didn't. It was really Nicola, who was the girl sucking the lollipop in the weightlifting photograph I was talking about earlier. I spoke to her before. I said, "Do you want to come on stage afterwards and talk about what you think with the actors and me and Val Williams, who was Professor Val, who was involved?"
Mm-hmm.
And she did, which was wonderful for me. She was on for me. A little circle became complete, and she was happy to do that. She had a choice to do that. So that was a really lovely moment.
What did she think about it?
She liked it. She thought that she'd seen the script, but she'd not. I'd shown her little clips from rehearsal right before, and I think she'd seen the script. I can't remember, but she was happy with the representation of both of her parents, and it was a bit of a risk, to be honest with you, bringing her on stage. But then she may have been sort of perhaps unlikely to have kicked off unless she thought it was really, really awful.
Yeah, but I mean, I think it makes sense on the whole attitude of, I guess, transparency and kind of this meta.
Yeah, I mean, it was again. It wasn't a thought that that I had that we can do that at the end. But she was there. I thought, well, it would just be intuitive here and bring her in, and that would be. And then afterwards, thought that's just a fantastic thing to do. She's there talking about the work live with the people on stage. So she's joined us on the stage. It's like she joined us in this sort of area of production, if you like.
And actually, I want to also ask you: do you feel like? I feel like you. There's a line in your work where it feels like it's work or photographs in places you shouldn't be. Do you feel that way? Because I mean, just to explain a little bit, but like in one you knocked on people's houses for this project.
Yeah.
Pictures of the real world.
Yeah.
And you knocked on people's houses and asked for permission.
Yeah.
But then down the line, you did a lot of work relating to kind of the government.
Secret spaces.
So secret spaces, there's one particular one where you go to places that the British government doesn't really declare as such.
That's the last thing.
Or doesn't acknowledge.
Yeah.
So they're like very secret to the point they don't talk about them.
Yeah.
But you gain access, and then Parliament. And in my head, do you feel like you do work in places you shouldn't be in?
Well, I think it was. After Pictures in the Real World, I'm realising I'm photographing people who have perhaps less social power than others, possibly. So I wanted to flip that around. The project I did after that, which was my first show at the Photographers Gallery, was the Velvet Arena, where I was in London photographing social events and private views at the Groucho Club and places like that. So areas of media and artistic sort of power, cultural power, and so on, and also political events as well, but social events.
So like kind of wealthy.
Yes, much more so. Yeah. So it's a bit of a binary swap from one to the other, perhaps. But then after that, I thought, well, the way forward here is to go into places where no one's been and make photographs where no one's been, and that was perhaps the kind of modus operandi, if that's the right word, for those three bodies of work that I made in secret spaces. I thought, if there's a future for documentary photography, then yes, it's in nuanced observation and so on and so forth, but also there's some real currency in addressing powerful institutions that we can't go into. That's surely part of what documentary photography can do, as a sort of, I'm not going to say, I was going to use the word expose then, which makes it sound a little bit tabloid, but no, that was part of it really, pushing back against about the sort of expectations of what documentary photography could be. And I wasn't the only one doing that. Ed Clark was doing that in Guantanamo Bay as well.
Oh yeah.
In Ireland, Donovan Wiley was doing that with the Maze Prison, and there were others as well. And going back in, photographic history, there's sort of other examples of people who've done that. The American woman photographer whose name's gone out of my head, which is really bad. Making work of just institutions, really, you know. So yeah, there's a whole bunch of reasons for that as well, you know.
How do you go through the feeling of uncomfortable? Because I'm guessing.
I go through what?
When you feel, I'm guessing. I mean, maybe I'm wrong, but like I assume that when you're in someone else's house, or when you're in a place that is owned by the military, that literally are kind of reminding you shouldn't be here. How do you plow through that?
Just start working. That's it. You just start working. You just look through the camera.
And just like focus on.
Well, it's not like everyone, you know, they weren't shouting at me all the while I was working or whatever. I mean, you know, and I'd made the arrangement to be in there. I did 3, right? 2 of which are published. There's the Commons, which is the House of Commons chamber. There's the Last Things, which is the so-called secret environment in central London, which is the one you referred to earlier, that the government don't admit. It was live then. I don't know if it's live now. I have no idea. And there was one where I did a place called Paddington Green High Security Prison, which was a place that you would go to if you were arrested under Counter-Terrorism Act. So there was lots of speculation about where it was and what it looked like and everything. So I did those 3. And you know, you have to be clear about why you're being there. I mean, you know, there's no way they'd let you in otherwise. So, you know, when you turn up, you're ready to work. It's simple as that. You know, there's no, you know, we were challenged in the Last Things when we were in the Pindar bunker. We were challenged, you know, from time to time by people who'd not got a wind of who we were or what we were doing or whatever. But it doesn't matter. It's, you know, I had approval to be there, so that was enough to make work.
But even, yeah, I guess I don't know, because I feel like there's always sometimes, especially when invited the first time to certain places, and actually something I noticed in the picture of Real World, you have there's a lot of pictures of like animals and children.
Animals and children.
It's true. Yeah, no, I think. I mean, that's what I noticed. There's a picture of a cat.
Yeah, I love that cat.
Yeah, I was gonna say, like, that cat. That doesn't look okay. Well, I mean, he doesn't look like he's doing well, but like, I don't know. Why did you take a picture of that cat?
I don't know. He's got a rather beautiful animal, really, in the wild. Really, that's what it felt like. And no collar on. I don't think the cat did.
No,
I enjoyed its presence. I didn't see it as a sort of flea-bitten cat at all. I thought it was quite a beautiful thing. You know, I enjoyed its sort of majestic presence in that kitchen. You know, that's as simple as that. I mean, you know, we don't. You know, you asking me questions of why did I take that picture? You can't always answer those questions, you know, easily. You know, as a photographer, you know that. You know why. I mean, I know I used to ask you that perhaps in the tutorial. Why did you take that picture? You know, but I'm challenging you. But I mean, I just think, you know. You're hopefully making things beyond words.
Yeah, no. I think I ask as in terms of like retrospectively.
Yeah.
When you, because then again you have to choose these certain pictures. You don't have to, and then again sometimes it's just a vibe. So it's just like
a vibe.
You just get a sense of, and even when taking a picture, but sometimes there's solid. My question, I think, and the reason I ask is more to see how you see that image, because I really like the cat because I feel like it becomes. I mean, in animals I'm very interested, but like, it has kind of a bit human in the way of, it looks at the camera and the way.
Colour's great as well, and he matches the rug. I think the cat matches the rug a little bit actually in that photograph. You know, there's only 18 photographs in that book, and again that was a sort of interesting thing why there are only 18, right? But I could go through every picture and give you a one-word answer to why I chose that photograph, but it would just be limiting. I mean, you know, I wouldn't want to do that. You know, I could say, you know, cat, rug, whatever. You know, suitcases, travel. You know, exit. You know, I mean, it's just, but it's sort of not what we take photographs for, is it? We don't take photographs to then explain them, you know, in words, because quite often those words can be reductive. I think, to the potential of the image, you know.
Okay.
And that's why actually all those photographs are untitled. They're known as untitled photographs. Although there was a review in the Financial Times this weekend which described one photograph, which I don't do when I show them.
Okay. What do you mean describe them? Just
Well, it said I
literally.
use, because you probably know, you're a photographer. You'll have names for your photographs that when in the file.
I try, yeah. Well, most of the times it's just like I type random things.
That's what I mean. But you can
Okay.
identify them with that.
Yeah.
You know, and that would have been cats or something. That photograph, you know. But I've got one which I described to myself as baby TV Earth.
Oh yeah, I really
Right,
like that.
and
Yeah,
that's
the
and that
picture's
was
great.
used. The Financial Times reviewed it this weekend for the show at the James Hyman Centre for British Photography, which is open now. And I never use that. It should just be untitled, but it just got slipped through. You know.
That's great. No, yeah, I really like that picture.
Thank you. Me too.
And I wanted to ask also, in this sense of kind of, have you seen any photography that recently, or like, do you remember any time you went to see a photography exhibition that challenged your idea of photography? So like, again, this kind of, this feeling that, that's an interesting step.
Yeah. Well, as you're probably beginning to realise, it gets less and less as you move on through your career or your sort of awareness of being a photographer. And I see work that I like quite a lot. Quite often that work is a sort of reiteration of stuff that's come before, and that's why I like it, but it's well done. I think there's a few things that have occurred to me that have popped. I mean, in the top of my head, the last thing you said was, "Oh, that's exciting because it's not been done like that before." I think you said. Actually, again, referring to Paul Graham's work, The Present, which is a street photography project in Manhattan, was quite an extraordinary body of work in terms of engaging with the genre itself and the sort of responsibilities of representation. That's how I read it as well, because they're all little sequences, so they're dealing with time and different episodes and different incidences or non-incidents on the street, and it's designed in such a way where you I think it's got fold outs, I can't remember. That was one body of work, and it actually, interestingly, as far as I'm aware, it was one of Paul's less successful books, actually, so it didn't have wide appeal, but they wouldn't do necessarily.
What about it like really made you like, whoa?
Well, I mean, as I said, it's the way that he engaged in with there are sort of narratives within it, so each outcome, to use a term, maybe 2 or 3 photographs which are kind of connected together, and they sort of seemingly document a kind of extended moment, if you like, on the street. Just nothing, just light, maybe a person doing something that you can't discern. So there's a lot of questions about what it is he's actually doing, but so it's a narrative, I suppose, that would be sort of difficult to sort of explain.
Yeah. I guess
right?
I'm asking too much.
No, it's fine. But so that there's that which I really enjoyed. There's an Irish photographer, and I partially recognise what he's doing, but nevertheless I think there's something there called Kieran Og Arnold, who won a first book award, I think 2015, called, and you might remember the title. It's something like.
Is that the title, or is that?
No, the title is Bars I Go to Hoping to Die, or I end up getting drunk again instead. Do you remember that?
It sounds familiar.
Yeah. And that's a sort of this amazing union of this guy who I don't know, though he was taught by a contemporary of mine, Paul Seawright, and Ken Grant, both Farnham people from where I studied. So Kieran Og Arnold's from a small town in Ireland, and the sort of triumvirate of work is him going back to his old town, small town, and engaging with people that he knows, boys, youth of his own age, drinking and fighting, and it's all quite dark and so on, and it maybe full stills. I mean, and so There's a personal connection. There's a revisitation of what he knew in a previous existence before he studied photography, and there's work that actually feels quite free of restrictions and conventions of photography in some ways. You rarely see a sort of compositional trope, right, in the work. It's very fluid, and I enjoy what he's doing actually. I don't know. I don't think there's another book. I follow him on Instagram and I see most of it there, So that feels quite fresh to me. His work feels quite fresh. I can see where it's coming from.
So it's not that technological.
Not at all.
Thing, because I feel like I do find that people are trying to innovate a lot, like base a lot of innovation on technology rather than maybe a way of going about things. I don't know. Yeah, I just have this feeling, and I don't know if it's like a cynical feeling of sometimes of being like, oof, like there's a lot of stuff being done, and that has been done, and a lot, especially that feels like reaching some form of edge is quite difficult. Like, oh, this is a new, or this feels fresh.
Yeah, it's harder. But what do you think about that? I mean, you're a young photographer, right? I mean, what's going on for you in that sense? Do you see photography which is that excites you, that's fresh and new, or not? I mean, where are you with that? Do you think?
I feel like if there's an exciting thing for me is media blending with each other, and there stops to be a just photography thing or just film or just sound. I think, but that's just the way I go about it. I think I mean.
Can you give me an example?
An example of a last work I saw that I really liked. I'm terrible with names, so I won't.
You can edit it in later.
Yeah. No, there was a guy recently that I saw that did I'm quite interested always by documentary work that is almost not forensic, but like there's this guy, I don't remember where in South America, he did a project about about witchcraft in South America. Well, witchcraft is kind of people that healers. But then the government kind of sort of making them disappear, and then there's this whole story, but it's very like it goes very methodically, and it's quite thick, and
what is it
it's almost journalistic. It almost could be used for a case.
Yeah, okay, all right.
I find that interesting. And then actually there's another guy, it's called Felipe, what's his name, Felipe something, I don't remember, and he won recently the Aperture award, okay, like a young and his book is kind of again collaborative. Actually, his first book was about how because I think he lived in Madrid for a while without a visa, if I'm not wrong, and he had, because he's somewhere in South America also, and he basically he recreated what the techniques police use to reduce someone, with I think also people that were living kind of avoiding the police,
okay,
in some form of clandestinity.
Okay, and what was it about that you liked, in terms of the photography or the app, whatever it was you were looking at? What was it that appealed to you?
I feel it feels less straightforward to read. I think also it's beautiful. I feel like I am very attracted to very beautiful, because I feel like sometimes again there's this whole thing about aesthetic and so if it's interesting as content, sometimes it might lack a bit of aesthetic, being something polished aesthetically. I find a lot of times, because it seems like, oh no, it's actually very interesting, but then it's just told in a way that's like, I can't really look at it, and I feel like it's just striking images, and then it's very specific, maybe collaborative. The work he won for recently was collaborative. It was about the young refugees, so like minors, and it's a center. It's called, in Spain, there's these centers where people that are, basically they're not adults, and all the images are very still.
Okay.
It doesn't feel. It's not like you're in the middle of a scene or.
Yeah.
I don't know. There's a bit theatrics about it again, and which makes you feel like you are. I don't know. They are in on it.
More and more, you see, I'm asking questions about the social value of work like that, and if you are going to, engage with people in that way, what's the value to them really?
With them.
Yeah. I mean, rather than just looking. I mean, I know that just looking can be part of a larger ensemble of change and social shifts and of who people are and so on and so forth. But I'm amazed that I still see work which just looks and doesn't choose to do anything else, or in the world, and beyond. There's a need for reporting, I mean, I think it's interesting that. Looking at what's happening in AI at the moment is going to decimate the commercial photography industry.
You think?
Yeah, I do. I think it's going to really change it. However, I do think there'll still be a need from the public or from certain quarters for there to be a truthful exchange, which is not AI. AI will be commercial practice. It's already happening. The way that people like IKEA, for example, produce digitally generated images, which are really nothing to do with photography, as in that they look like photography. They're pretending to be photographs, right? So it's going to it's a real game changer in that sense. But there's still, I think, documentary practice, photojournalistic practice in times of political need are sort of required even more, actually. So there's that sense of kind of going back to realism, perhaps, in some ways as well. But it's then
realism, what do you mean?
Meaning just straight work. This is what something looks like, right? But it's then what do you do with that photograph, and how does that fit into a whole sort of network of potential systemic change in a societal level?
Yeah, I mean, I wanted to ask you. I think connects with this.
Yeah,
is what's the real world? You call it pictures of the real world.
That was the title I gave it in 1988.
Well, I know, but I think but it's interesting because I think we're talking. I think this blunt approach you're talking about is because there is this feeling that there is something that is more genuine or there's.
Well, I think that was partly. I mean, I kept the title because it was the original title when I published it 25 years later. But I think there was something there about me being from the north of England and coming to the south of England, and being in a sort of non-industrial environment in Farnham and so on and so forth. And there was a little bit of that. It's slightly immature in some ways. I mean, I was quite young, but I mean, there was something like that. There's something about that. Something about look at this. It was the height of a recession. I'm not saying that those. I'm sure that those circumstances could have been found. Or sorry, the appearance that pictures from the real world sort of promotes of people's lives could have been found in the south of England as well at that time. So it was slightly redundant in that sense. But I mean, I kind of like it as a title now.
Yeah. No, I think it's interesting. But
and it plays off the real, what is real, and the constructed nature of realism and so on. I think it was doing that even then, actually.
Yeah, I mean, I agree with what you were saying about just observing, or even when I'm doing this kind of interview thing, and I'm more and more I'm like, okay, but I have to, you can just stay into a talk, because for example, I feel like I went into a gallery not long ago, and then there was all these books that were about all the some for problems, social and perspectives, economical perspective, all sort of books that if you read, you can kind of maybe understand the world better and kind of see the problems. But then I was like, how come there's all these books and there's a lot of talk about all the issues that are around, but then I feel like there's not necessarily much going on about it. I feel like there's an awareness.
This is what we talk about. I mean, I think with pictures in the real world though. I mean, I never made that. When I made that work, I understood that Lisa and John, I didn't straight away, but I realised that they didn't need any help from me or my photography at all. John was working. Lisa was she had a little business. So they weren't in need necessarily, those people.
Well, no, you went to knock on their house, no?
What do you mean?
You went to them.
Yeah.
Yeah, that's what I mean.
Yeah. I mean, that, what I'm saying is that they weren't in social need in some ways. They were just living in a particular way, But of course, it's translated in a different way, and part of my work has promoted that perhaps incorrect reading of it. When I look back at it, which is again part of the reason for doing the play, so we can address things like this. One of the things that John said in the play was, this is how people will remember me when I'm gone, and he was very clearly addressing that when he was looking at these photographs from 25 years before. He was saying, "Gosh, this is how I've been represented. So I've got to, now's my time to speak and say something about that." So so we maybe strayed a little bit really, because I was talking about social effect and the sort of the way documentary practice can contribute to systemic change or not, and I think that it can be a responsible document, can contribute to things, a wider sort of discourse of protest. Actually, a good example of that would be Gideon Mendel's work around rising water levels in the world, so global warming basically.
Yeah, the one where they have the water up to their...
Yeah, and it's a very simplistic device what he's doing there, but he's doing it in a way that speaks to many people, and he works really hard at that, and he gets change at local level and things like that. I've spoken to him about it recently. I was saying, how do you justify what you do, Gideon? What does it do? And he gave me this whole list of things where film stars have got involved and funded a whole village, which is a bit naughty actually. But there's been this happen, there's that happen. So his activity is making some, through his photography, is making some social change, and his photography leads that. So it's still possible to do that, but so I think we've just got to we've got to be careful when we look at. I think they're the questions when we're looking at documentary practice now, right? As they always have been. The questions have not gone away. Who's this for? Who's benefiting from this? Right? Those are the two fundamentally things, really.
Yeah. I mean, and also because I feel like a lot of stuff is like there's a lot of things shown. Like even not everyone. I mean, like you can go through 20 amazing projects on Instagram just like scrolling, and but that's what I mean. I feel like that's why maybe there's this feeling of like, okay, how can you, because I feel like that has a massive, whatever you do, whether it's fashion, documentary, like is this thought of like, oh, I have to, how do you make something that doesn't end up falling in this kind of black hole? And I don't know if that's just like not selfish, but like, like, oh, I want to stand out and
yeah, but it's particularly harder for younger photographers. I get that, I
don't know if it's harder.
What I mean is in terms of getting seen. I mean, one of the sort of advantages I've got as an older photographer, having been around for a long time, is that I've got more of a possibility of getting my work shown. Although I am sort of, a particular gender and race, and age, which kind of perhaps it's not being favoured at the moment. It does. Or does it help or doesn't it help? I don't know. But, there's obviously a cultural shift in terms of what's being looked at, which is good. But I think yes, Instagram, you flip it open, this it just never stops.
Yeah,
it's difficult. I find that difficult.
I think I'll ask you the last question, because I want to go back to the educational side.
Oh yeah.
And do you feel do you feel like I assume the approach has changed generally in education, in British arts education.
Mm-hmm.
Do you feel like there's been much of a change since you studied in terms of approach? Of course, technology and blah blah blah, but how people teach since you were?
Well, there are more. I mean, education is different. It's under different financial considerations.
What do you mean?
Well, when I went, it was free. University education was free, or you paid a little bit. So that meant that the universities were funded by the state a lot more than the students, if you know what I mean. It's less of a business. The idea of the inquiry, the question in higher education, you come and you're studying, what is it you're trying to do, was very much alive. At the moment, it's sort of connected to vocationalism and getting jobs
now
within arts education.
So now it's more...
That's the shift that's going on at the moment. Okay, there's an ideological shift that's going on at the moment in higher ed, which places emphasis on arts courses like ours to what jobs can they get, right? So and that's kind of leading at the moment, and that's coming from top down, really, not the institution but the government, really. So the shift away from a critical thought, so shifting away from critical thought to making works which are making money, right? That's a very simplistic way of putting it in the time that we have. However, I think with photography, my honest and sincere belief is that if one studies photography or any fine art form actually in a critically engaged way or an immersive way, that person is ideally equipped for a variety of different outcomes in terms of their career.
Like what? So what jobs?
Well, you know yourself, you're doing all sorts of different things here, you know. But I mean, you know, if you so choose, I mean, you remember, without mentioning names, you'll remember students have come out of here, become designers, become curators, a few photographers, right, still going. Some don't come to postgrad because they want to get a job. They want to, you know, the older students that we've had, you know, come because they want to study it and so on, and enhance their practice. And I just think, you know, organisational, being with people, you know, working in groups, creative thinking, problem solving. As an artist, that's with your own work. That's what you're doing all the time. And I think that, you know, in terms of an institution goes, to retain that space of research and immersive engagement is really, really important, because it's for the benefit of everybody. You know, it's a benefit of everyone's health and wealth, the creative industries as well, you know. And that's sort of being overlooked a little bit right now. And that's one of the fundamental differences, really, you know. So we've got to sort of respond to that as educators, you know, within the guidelines that are being offered to us, you know. But I think, you know, we can still find ways to preserve that space which is of value. Because when I studied, going back to 1988, I never did an MA. I only did a BA. That's, you could do what you wanted, pretty much, for 3 years. There were projects, there were modules, so to speak. But most of the course, half of it was just doing your own thing. Pretty similar to what we do here, actually. Maybe half of the MA was doing your own thing. So we preserve that space. Sort of answers your question. There are differences.
No, because in Spain we have a very different, like, Spain is still very, well, there's no much uni courses in Spain for photography.
I was going to ask you about that.
It's like a practical thing. I think there is a few MAs, but it's very expensive, like, and it's not even
in photography.
There is master, and it's like it's really an extra thing. It's not really considered to the level of, I feel like there must be some photojournalism. I mean, here maybe I'm talking wrong, but like in the UK I feel like there's a way different approach about photography and film. Things like photography and film, I think, are more valued.
I mean, the other thing about, I said what I said about AI, but someone like yourself is ideally placed to step into that AI space.
Yeah.
You know, as a visual communicator yourself. All photography graduates are, regardless of what they've learnt on their course. They're all ideally placed to direct and to be involved with the way artificial intelligence imagery is being produced. I think it's all to play for still. Every possibility is still there.
Well, okay. Yeah. I mean, I think that's good. I had you hostage for 2 hours, so I think that'll be. Yeah, I think that's it.
Okay.
Nice
do you want
to say something to at the end or not?
Well, I thought I'd already done it, actually.
Yeah.
I'll give you 2 there, actually.
Okay,
I think 2
endings.
endings.
I was gonna say there was good ending. I didn't know you were doing it on purpose, but yeah.
Yeah.
It was nice finishing. Okay, I didn't catch the cue. But anyways, okay. Well, thank you very much.